But this is our final presentation. So we are recording today, just so everyone knows that, so that if anyone is added throughout the school year, we have it as a resource available to support those who may need to be the public agency representative. So we'll get rolling. I have met most of you, I think, on the call at this point. I'm Linda Watkins, Director of Special Services, and I have been here in Wayne Township since July 5th. So I'm pretty veteran at this point, over a month now, but glad to be here, glad to be part of the team. And we have Mr. Todd Hawks, our Assistant Director of Special Services, who I'm sure you all know. We still do not have our third person up there, so you notice that there's just the two of us together on the slide, and we don't have a third person yet. That position is vacant, so we are seeking our assistant director supporting secondary. Todd primarily does the elementary work, but he has been all hands on deck and just helping with everything because he's amazing. And so it's sort of a triage approach over here right now. So but we're glad to be here and be part of the group. So we wanted to ground ourselves in our why statement before we get going today. So I'll give you just a minute to look over that. And so we highlighted a couple of phrases that we find valuable. And there's so many options that you can look at and see the value in the words. But we always think it's important to start our meetings with remembering our why and grounding us in that work. This is important work that we do. And so today we are going to talk through the definition of FAPE, what exactly the public agency rep is responsible to do. We'll give you some tips on do's and don'ts in case conferences, what the district role is through the process, and then we will try to leave some time at the end if you have any questions or just have specific areas of support.
All right, so if you will indulge for a second, and this is probably saying it's not activated, but you're going to answer a question, and that is, when in your career have you felt least prepared for a conference? Just give me just a second. I'll get that activated. And then if you follow the instructions on the screen, then you'll be able to go ahead and answer that. All right, should be active now. The tough case conferences are hard, aren't they? First conference with an angry parent. Those get easier. All right, so we've got some ideas of there when we felt least prepared. So we want to make sure, surprise case conference, yeah, we want to make sure that you have the tools to be prepared for case conferences and you can know what to expect and what you have to come. Someone just added when they're asked to attend on a student they don't know. That's a good one as well. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about what a public agency rep is, the legal definition is someone who speaks on behalf of the public agency, which is the entity that is responsible for providing special education and related services. So that's really what the public agency is. Anyone want to raise a hand and tell us what FAPE represents? What is the acronym? Anyone?
Free and appropriate public education.
Oh, yeah, Terry got it. Jen, thank you. Free and appropriate public education, yes.
How many points was that worth, Todd?
I don't know, Terry, because you didn't raise your
100.
hand.
At
I
least
didn't raise your hand. I don't know. No, it's good. Terry, love in our hearts. That's what it's worth.
there's no prize, but if there were, you won.
Yes.
I'm going on mute now.
So free and appropriate public education, that means that the services are provided at the public expense. It meets the standards of, in our case, the Indiana Department of Education, includes preschool, elementary, secondary, so that's ages 3 through 22, and it's in conformity with the unique IEP or 504 plan. That includes the assessment for eligibility, general education services, related services, special education classes, accommodations, and modifications. Opposite of that, what is the denial of FAPE? So we can be considered as denying FAPE if we don't provide special education or related services outlined in the IEP, if we fail to provide accommodations, if we fail to properly assess in areas of a suspected disability, if we do inappropriate assessment, if we do assessment that's not necessary, may not be looking at the right areas, if we do inappropriate placement, we fail to meet the goals and the school doesn't adjust. So goals aren't being met by a student. We need to come back to the table and look at what that instruction is. Do goals need to be readjusted? But really look about what we can do to better support that student. And then also IEP meetings without parent notification, which any parent notification goes through the Indiana IEP system. Even if it's a revision without a meeting, there's still a notice that goes through the system. So written procedures are really just saying that we establish a process for identifying students and evaluating students and locating them ages 3 through 22 who are in need of special education and related services, regardless of the severity of their disabilities. We also have other written procedures like our standard operating procedures and guidance documents that describe how we operate internally.
And so the PAR has to be a qualified person. The law is pretty specific about the pieces that need to be in place in order for a person to serve as the PAR in a case conference. And so we have a list here of just what is found in Article 7 and also just some of our additions. So we do want the person serving as PAR to understand our procedure. So as a department, you know, we have our process. We need them all of you to understand what that means and how the procedures should go. The PAR should have knowledge of the family and the student. So hopefully you're not walking in cold to a conference and trying to serve in that capacity. This is a big one, and we'll talk about it again a little bit later, but just understanding the process for allocation of special education resources. So just being really clear on what is available to support students so that it can be allocated at the table. And then also just an overall ability to ensure compliance with the IEP development. So, and particularly just all of the content that's included and what comes out of that meeting. You may not be the one doing the heavy lifting on the IEP itself, but as the PAR, you know, you just want to have your eyes on it and make sure that you're pointing out things that need to be updated and trying not to get anything in there that could get us in trouble down the road. Thinking about too when and why we may table a conference and then need to reconvene. So there are times that it is just it's not going anywhere that we want to go with a conference, or maybe we don't have the information, we weren't prepared for various reasons. Either we didn't have a heads up, or you know, we need to stop. It's too heated, the parent's too upset. So just understanding when to make the decision to call it. And then two, we mentioned knowing the process for allocating resources, but then also the PAR is actually required to have authority to commit those resources. And so we want to be sure, you know, as much ahead of time that you know what the resources are, and that, you know, it's whenever possible that you can prepare and be ready that day. What you don't want to do is say, I don't know, I got to call Linda and Todd. You know, we want you to be empowered and prepared in the moment. And then two, the PAR has to be qualified to provide or supervise the provision of specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of the students with disabilities. So, you know, there is that instructional component of just understanding overall what's available for students and being able to speak to what the school has to offer, as well as with the general education curriculum, same thing, just being able to, articulate what exactly that curriculum is and how students can access it and so forth. And so we kind of like bucketed these into 4 different areas. So the first is preparation. The PAR needs to make sure that everybody is prepared walking in. So again, it may not be you doing the heavy lifting, but your teachers should be ready to roll. They should have a complete or nearly complete draft ready to go, so that, it just creates a more efficient case conference, allows for better participation. When we are prepared on the front end, we have a better conference and we typically have better outcomes. So it's important to get that work done. We have to have certain people at the table that are mandatory participants for a conference. And so we want to be sure that everybody who has to be there is there, or we have a written excusal signed off by the parent to say that they don't have to be there, or maybe it's just not something that's pertinent to their work that particular day. And then 2, we need to have a note taker available for the conference, and we'll talk a little bit more about notes later. Also, just the facilitation in general. So giving the flow to the meeting, making sure voices are heard, keeping everybody on task. The PAR is really the person orchestrating all of that. And I think there are times, depending on the strength of your teacher of record, there might be times that they sort of take the wheel and they're driving for a little bit in the meeting, and that's fine. But you just as the PAR want to have that overall control of what's happening with the case conference from start to finish. And then just ensuring that everybody's completing what they're supposed to complete. And then finally, with the conclusion of the meeting, just making sure that's summarized properly, everybody's on the same page about what just happened, next steps, that sort of thing, and that the forms necessary are filled out. So we always need that ACR Skyward form to be completed so that we can keep accurate records in our office. So I mentioned mandatory participants. So if you would drop in the chat, who are mandatory participants in a case conference? You don't have to get every single one. So if you could just think of 1 or 2 that come to mind, you can just put those. Okay, I see parents, students, gen ed teacher, PAR, therapists, instructional strategist, student at secondary, related service, OT, SLP. Okay. So wide range. These are definitely all people I've seen at conferences, I will say. Okay, so we'll pull up the next, who the actual mandatory people are. Drum roll. So we do have to have a public agency rep, hence the training today. Parent or guardian, teacher of record, which can be an SLP if your primary is a speech or language impairment. Your gen ed teacher, instructional strategist. Sherry, I see you on the instructional strategist. A lot of people didn't get that in other trainings. And remember too, often that's the same person in another role. You can serve 2 roles in a case conference. And that's often what we do there. An evaluation team member. So if there's any sort of an evaluation, your school psych is usually the person that's going to serve in that role. Now, there are some things that we don't have listed as mandatory. And so this gets confusing because there are people we want at the table and hope to have. We'll start with students. So unpacking that, it is absolutely correct that at the secondary level, once they're transition age, that the student has to be invited to the case conference. That's part of our transition requirements for indicator 13. They have to be invited. They are not mandatory participants. They are mandatory to be invited, but then the parent can still have the discretion if they don't want them to actually participate. So that can be tricky. And usually they do participate, and they should, honestly, in my opinion. I think that that's very important for their self-advocacy and their growth to be a part of it. But technically the parent is still the decision maker on that until the point that the student turns 18. Also our therapists, so our OT or PT, And I would put like nurses in this category. There are kids who have access to different related services that are necessary and part of FAPE for them, but those folks are not technically mandatory participants. So we don't need an excusal if they can't be there. It's best practice to let the parents know. It's best practice to get reports ahead of time, have them put their information in. We want them to be represented, and we want everything to be accurate in the IEP, but we don't have to do that full excusal on the notice of meeting. So important distinction when you're doing those. Was there anybody else, Todd, that was listed that I think it was just related in the student?
I think you got them.
Okay, great. Okay, and so allocation of resources, we throw that term around a lot, so we thought it would be helpful to call out. It's not just maybe what you're thinking of with resources like actual things for students. I mean, that may be the case, but it could also just be the time of a staff member. So recently, I'll give you an example. We recently had a due process that we settled, and really Tara started this process and I just had to finish it. She did a great job getting it almost to the finish line, but between the two of us, we allocated quite a bit of staff time of like one specific person. And so, that's something where, we had to have the authority to know like what that person's schedule was. Do they have the capacity? Can we put that on the table? So that would be considered a resource. So that's something that's part of our team. If we're going to add staff, we think about that a lot. That's a huge allocation and one that we really want to be thoughtful. And then, any sort of training that we want to do, sometimes parents will request, a specific disability training or something very tailored to the needs of their child. So if we're putting that in the IEP, that's a resource. That's going to take time and effort from staff. That's going to take, time for the people participating in that sort of thing. If we're offering additional evaluations of some kind, if we're offering to do an FBA, and update the BIP or that sort of thing, that's a resource. Any sort of extra service, materials, programs, technology. I mean, you get the point. Like it can be a lot of different things that we're thinking about. So as you're allocating, there might be a lot of things that we really can't offer and that are very appropriate for our student, but we just want to be thoughtful because we have only so many resources and we need to be sure that we're getting them to the right places and to the right kids to serve them well. And also just the continuum piece. So the last one that we have is just our continuum of services. And so sometimes the decision is made that a student needs to go to a more restrictive environment or a more restrictive program of some kind. And if that's the case, that's a change in placement, but really there's a lot of resources that are associated with that change in placement. So thinking of that as well.
So we want to take a moment to talk about supervising specially designed instruction, which is part of the responsibility. So specially designed instruction is what makes special education special. It's what we are specifically as educators doing for this student to help them meet their goals. And SDI has to address the unique needs of a student that result from their disability and ensure that the student has access to the general education curriculum so they can meet the educational standards of the public agency that applies to all students. We owe that to students. It's what we do for them. And when we write SDI, it is really focused on what are the adults going to specifically do to help that student. It's not what we expect the student to do. There are a couple of great resources here, an SDI handbook, which gives you specific strategies for SDI for specific needs. And then there's a document about SDI tips, but we have to be able to make sure that that is high quality as the PAR and it's going to serve the needs of the student. We also talk about having knowledge of general education curriculum. This is a huge part of what the PAR does because they're going to have to know the materials that are utilized in the building, what are the available resources, supplemental curricular materials that can be used. We do have approved lists of these things in Wayne Township, so we have to be familiar with those. What assessments are given and can be given, different ways to formally and informally evaluate student mastery, scope and sequence, lesson design, how we accommodate and modify for different student needs, UDL practices, universal design for learning, what are high leverage and best practices, and then also a knowledge of the Indiana academic standards. This is super important because our goal is to provide students access to the gen ed curriculum, and we have to know the different ways that we can get there to do that. So when we table or reconvene a case conference, know that it is totally okay to say that we are unprepared to discuss a request or do not have the adequate data to make a decision at that moment in time, and we need to reconvene a case conference in whatever amount of time. So we set how much time we're going to need, then we come back to the table. Some reasons you may want to reconvene a case conference is if we're at a stalemate. I know Dr. Watkins has some stories about a really long conference that has been multiple parts that she'll share with you, but sometimes our brains just aren't working hard anymore and we're tired and we may need to stop for a moment. We're not getting anything done. We're not being productive. Oftentimes, we see maybe things are getting too contentious and we need to stop because there's a need for teammates to be able to get back to baseline. That's not just families, that's staff as well. I've had to stop case conferences. We take 10. I've had to send staff members to go get a drink of water. I've had to debrief with them. We've had to have quick therapy together to get through the rest of the conference, but it may mean that we need to stop and get back together another day. If you ever see that an advocate is involved in a conference, but they've not been invited, you need to table that case conference and make sure the advocate is invited. That person has agreed to work with the parent has asked for their help, and they are part of the team. I learned this the hard way many years ago. Proceeding with a conference, the advocate wasn't involved. Just make sure the parent has all the supports they need. I think of it as an accommodation for a parent. We want to let them have that so that they can be as prepared and as informed as possible. If there's an unexpected legal representative that's present, you need to table the conference, because if the family has an attorney at the table, we have to have the opportunity to have ours as well. And at minimum, you're going to want to have Dr. Watkins, myself, or the other assistant director involved in that case conference if we need to investigate resources or collect additional data. Dr. Watkins?
Yes, and so Todd mentioned my story. This was just something that just happened at my previous district, but I had a very, very contentious case that had been a due process, and we had settled, but we had a lot of open ends that had to be finished in order to come to a conclusion on that particular case. And so we met and had to table twice. So we met a total of 3 times, working through all of the different areas. So we had some things we had to get in the IEP from the settlement agreement and the due process. We had a reevaluation review to do, including a ton of different assessments, updated FBA and BIP. There were just a lot of things. Plus, then we had to do the annual for the year, and it was a situation where there was an interpreter involved, which does lengthen it because you have the back and forth with the interpreter. But point being, we did have to table it multiple times, and I had to make the decision. We were up at almost 6 p.m. People had to get their kids. I had to get my own kids. We logged a total of 7 hours on that case conference. And so I would say, I hope for all of you that you never, ever, ever have a conference that lasts that long. But it can be done. And this was obviously a case where there was not a lot of trust, and there have been a lot of issues on the table. It was challenging, but we did the right thing by tabling and reconvening, and then we finally got through all of the content to support, and we were able to get everything cleaned up and in place. And so an example again that I hope you never experience, but it can happen. Okay, so the characteristics that we are looking for when you have the opportunity to serve as PAR for us, again, we mentioned the knowledge, knowing the law, knowing the limits, knowing when to call it. We want to be sure that I said before that you have a note taker that really can capture what's happening. If it's not in the notes, it didn't happen. And so again, another non-example would be just I had a due process that was filed, and someone took notes, but they never got it in the notes of the case conference of the IEP. Therefore, it doesn't matter what happened because it wasn't captured and it wasn't put in the document after the fact. And so I personally am terrible at trying to talk and lead and facilitate and then also take notes. it's fragmented. I forget what I'm doing. I stop, like they're terrible notes. I just admit that. Don't ever ask me to do that. You won't be happy with the result. But I just think, so if you're in the position where you're facilitating, hand that off to someone who's super conscientious and probably doesn't have a whole lot to say or have a really big part of the meeting. And I think you'll have the best notes. And then too, just remember to stay the whole time. I know it's tough with schedules and things are crazy in the buildings. We understand there are emergency situations, but if you're there, you are, as you already saw, a mandatory participant, which means that we have to have you there, without, unless there's parent permission, but then all of these things that are legally required that you're able to do wouldn't be happening if you're not at the table. And we also want to think about just setting the tone. So this could be a very intimidating process for parents coming in. We don't know what their experiences have been with school in the past. And so we want to do everything we can to greet them, offer them water, have name badges, make sure they know who all is at the table, what role each person is playing that particular day, so that they are put at ease immediately, have their parent rights. Talk about the strengths of their child. That always puts a parent at ease to hear positives about their child. We all love to hear nice things about our kids. And so that's going to just set the tone in the room, let the parent know that you actually legitimately care about their child and that you're going to start things off on the right footing for that meeting, and then just be as collaborative as possible. I love the book by Patrick Schwartz, From Disability to Possibility. There's a chapter called Parents Are the Gold Standard. And so that's just what I always personally strive to do in meetings, make sure that they know that they're the most important person in the room and that we're so thankful that they're there and part of the team, and really take the time to seek their input, stop the conversation, ask for their thoughts. Sometimes depending on, the parents, maybe how outgoing they are, it can be a very difficult thing for them to maneuver if maybe they're not a person that likes to speak up in a large group, or they might be intimidated just because often the group around the table, we have a lot of experts and a lot of us have been doing this work for a very long time, and it's easy for us to sort of go in that mode of just automatic, we know what we're doing, here's what has to happen. And so we just want to take the time to be collaborative with our parents always. And then too, when it comes time to make the decisions with the case conference, sometimes there's a misconception that it's a majority rules vote. And the reason that is not the case is because the parent would always lose. And so public agency gets a vote and the parent gets a vote. So there's always more of us than them. We want to listen. The PAR's job is to listen to all the amazing experts that we have around the table and then glean the most important information and make a decision on the district's behalf. And so that's why we don't let just anybody be a PAR, because there really is, an important decision to be made. And we want to be sure that the person sitting in the seat is equipped to do so, and understands all of the intricacies of the situation. So when things go wrong, because sometimes we don't disagree, so we each get a vote. If things go wrong, the parent can disagree, file, a mediation, or file a due process. And then that starts a whole different set of work that typically lands with OSS administrators. But, we just want to make sure that if we're all working together, we're collaborative. Often things don't go that way. We have very few of those cases that actually get to that point. So that's why it's important to have the parent input, but then to just support what exactly the vote on behalf of us is going to be.
So some of these things we've talked about, some quick reminders about do's and don'ts. Do hold a staffing or data review before a meeting so we can be best informed and have the best solutions and options at the table. Do not predetermine outside of the case conference. This is why it's so important to have multiple options. When we bring one option to the table, we're kind of saying we've predetermined this is what's going to happen or what should happen. Do rely on special education staff to know Article 7, to know the law. Do not force a team into eligibility or placement. It really has to be a case conference decision together collectively. Do document parent requests and school responses. Don't leave contentious points out of the case conference notes. Sometimes we don't want to put those things in writing. It's important. We need to know what's been previously discussed. And It helps us to know what topics to possibly avoid at the next case conference if they don't have to be revisited. Do focus on positives first and do not start the meeting and then leave. I've not really seen this happen much in Wayne, but I've seen it in the past in other places I've been. If we're the par, we're there for the entire conference. Do invite one of us when you need it, and we'll talk about what those circumstances might be. And don't say we don't have the time, money, staff, etc., because it's sending a message to parents that we don't want to. Your kid isn't important enough. It doesn't matter to us. And we are required to provide supports to help students be successful.
And so we do want you to invite us when you need us. That's what we're here for. We take that very seriously. That's literally our job description, is to show up when you need us. So if you've got a request for a one-on-one that you anticipate, anything contentious or litigious, please bring us in. If you're looking at a challenging placement change, manifestation determination, we'll talk about that more on the next slide. But just an example recently, we have an open due process right now in the district that was just filed. And so the person who was overseeing it understood early where we were headed, and she brought us in on the front end. And so although it still ended up in a due process, we were able to lay some very strong groundwork, get a lot of things in writing that are very helpful to us. And I was able to sort of build our case in writing, which puts us in a pretty good spot for this particular case. And so while we don't know the outcome, I will just say, that's an example of where we're so thankful when we know early. And often, Todd and I are going to have a little different lens just because this is what we do. And we'll be able to help sort of build what needs to happen on our end as well earlier. And it's always easier if that's the way that it goes, as opposed to a situation that we had absolutely no idea and then something's filed and it's brand new to all of us. So manifestation determinations, we all just love these meetings. These are often some of the tough ones I notice. I think every presentation we've given, that's been mentioned as one of the least prepared conferences for someone. We have some great things in place in Wayne just to help track. When you guys get this presentation, it's linked to your manifestation determination checklist. And so that just gives you the steps ahead of time that need to be done. Todd and I will come out and do the manifest for you. We have eventually the secondary director will do them for secondary campuses just like Penny did. But since we don't have anybody yet, I'm going to support those as they come. So please just be sure that you're prepared and you've completed the checklist. You have the information in that's necessary so that we are all able to have an efficient meeting. Also, LinkedIn is the manifestation tracker for this year. So we have tabs across the bottom if you could find your school and add the information as it happens so that we can keep tabs on how many manifests we are having across the district. And then just a reminder, we get 10 free days per school year. So 10 days that students do not have to receive any sort of services that if there's a removal from class without service. So any day, every day after 10, we are obligated to either be providing services or to offer compensatory down the road. And we always have to have a manifest because the 10-day triggers that change of placement, and that makes us have to go into a manifest. So any day, any part of any day, bus transfer or transportation suspension if they have transportation as a related service, last hour of the day, if things aren't going well and you call the parent to pick them up 1 hour before the end of the day, that's a whole day. That related service, that's a whole day. Any portion of any day counts as a whole day, and you only get 10 for the entire school year. The clock does not reset once you get to that manifest. If something would occur after the student is back and you have another removal, another out-of-school suspension, you're going to trigger another manifest. And then if something else happens, another manifest, and you're going to do them all year long. So that's why we want to be really mindful of our days and the services that are required. And then there are questions that go in the IEP as part of that process. We would ask that you not pre-fill those or have your teachers pre-fill anything in those, because that would really be borderline predetermining, because that's sort of the heart of those meetings. We always say to have a completed draft, but in this case, that's the discussion is the main portion of the manifest and the critical piece that needs to be done as a group. So we don't want to walk in and make a determination ahead on that. But, obviously manifests, like I said, are not a great fun time for any of us, but they're just part of it. And so we want to be as detail oriented as we can, as prepared as we can be, so that hopefully when we're tracking our discipline data, we know exactly what we're looking at and where we can support and offer resources to schools. So just a couple final thoughts from me on this. If things that I see, if parents want to record a case conference, we have to record it too. So sometimes I've had parents try to be sneaky and like, I can tell what they're doing. They're like trying to really, mess with their phone and not tell me what they're doing. So I just ask like, oh, hey, are you going to record this? And then sometimes you catch people off guard. But just say like, oh, that's totally fine. Yep, you can record. We're going to record too. We just need that record so that if it comes back and they have an issue with something that's happened, we also have the same recording and we know exactly what was said and done at the conference. But here's what I will say. If no one's recording, you don't record. So I had a teacher last year who just wanted to be thorough and just have a good record and started on virtual conferences recording like how we are today, recording every meeting. And that's creating a student record. And quite frankly, we want a record of absolutely everything because it can come back to bite us if something isn't done perfectly. We try our best to make a good faith effort to follow practices and procedures all the time, but it's just not good to make a student record when there doesn't need to be one. So, and then to case conference notes, when you have that note taker ready to roll, but please don't try to be a court stenographer. So just think, topic of discussion, the bullet points of the outcomes that were decided upon. We don't need to type every single word that is uttered. It's not helpful and often it's inaccurate when you try to overdo the notes. So just be sure that like whatever happened, you actually get it in. And like I mentioned, we don't want to end up in a situation where we have no notes because that's not helpful either. Because if we do get in a legal situation down the road, we live and die by that last agreed upon IEP. And so it matters what goes in, but we just want it to be, factual and the outcomes as opposed to, just every single opinion that's shared. And then finally, just always, as you're working through this process, do your best to build trust and rapport with the parents. I don't want you to have 7-hour case conferences. 7-hour case conferences occur when trust is broken and there is no rapport. And so when families trust you, it is much faster. They're more efficient. They know that you have their child's best interest at heart. And that's really what I've been seeing in Wayne. I mean, I'm just so pleased and honored to be a part of this team because I see just the incredible relationships that you have with families and what a nice job, everyone is doing with that. So I think we can just continue to build on that and have that customer service be, to continually work with the families. They're going to trust us. They're going to have relationships with us. And honestly, it just keeps things running smoothly from our standpoint.
So some resources for you. Article 7 is linked there, Navigating the Course, which is a parent version of Article 7, but I often find that that's a helpful version for me to look through as well. Our procedures manual, there's a document here called Wise Word Choice for Administrators. So watching what we're saying in conferences and how we reframe some things in a different way. There's a link to the Office of Special Services Resource Hub. You've been hearing a lot about it. You will continue to do so. It's updated on a frequent basis. Any new guidance, any new documents, any training, any news is going to be loaded there. There's a document that shows our continuum of services. It often helps to explain to what different LREs are and what the continuum of services looks like, because they may not understand when they're asking for different things. The SDI handbook and tips, our manifest determination checklists, procedural safeguards for families, and then tips on creating a collaborative case conference. What we're going to ask you to do is, and I'm trying to get this link here, is if you can complete this PAR training survey, just to say that you were here today. We need to have record of who is here and who has been trained so that they are able to serve as PARs. And let me get that link for you. Any questions in our last couple of minutes together?
Quick one, are we still using LTC for languages that are not Spanish?
Yes.
Unfortunately, Tammy's last day is tomorrow, so who will be our contact for anything that we need for IIEP and beyond?
Tammy's last day was today.
Oh, today.
Yeah.
Send them to me, and Linda and I are getting together on a frequent basis to address these while we
Yeah.
figure
We have
out
another interview at 4:00. Fingers crossed, you guys. We've been trying to fill it. Todd, we should probably stop recording before I just rant on about it. But yeah, we're trying really hard to fill it. We miss Tammy all